This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for promoting the Patreon at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. Pleased to say we've had some success on that front. Thank you very much, super summer-uppers out there. Our patronage increased steadily since we published our last BOCO episode. So clearly people know what's what and they're flocking over there.
Huzzah! I
would love to see a few more sheep flocking in that direction. Just saying.
Sheep?
Well, that's a terrible way of putting it. But, you know.
Mighty intellectual, independent thinking.
That's right.
Incredibly good looking.
Incredibly good looking people hanging out at the Let Me Sum Up Patreon. Oh, God.
Definitely not sheep.
Pick up. Okay. I'll still leave it there. It's nice to see you. I'm at Gadigal country tonight, as per usual.
And I'm also joined by a man who is freshly back from the beach, a sun-kissed, windswept and salt-encrusted Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Well, I did stand on the beach skipping stones a lot, but it was grey and rainy. And anybody who's ever met me knows that vampires look tanned next to me. But it was a lovely week away, and I embraced full middle-aged malehood by reading my first Patrick O'Brian, Aubrey Maturin 18th century seafaring novel, which was delightful, actually. In between many naps.
I thought you were going to say wearing like Birkenstocks with socks as well. But
I have standards, Frankie.
I know. That doesn't go with your paisley ties.
Yeah. All right. Well, on this week's show, we consider the Climate Change Authority's very recent ruminations on sectoral decarbonisation pathways and 2035 emission reduction targets. But first, a couple of weeks ago, the Albanese government released the long-awaited National Energy Performance Strategy, the document designed to drive the government's agenda on all things energy efficiency, electrification and demand flexibility. And while it has been billed as a framework that will be populated with further actions, at the moment at least, there isn't a lot of policy meat on the bone, leaving some stakeholders wondering why this document took 18 months to pull together. Frankie, like me, you have a keen interest in all things energy performance as part of your day job. What is your take on where we landed with this strategy?
Well, I think the point that you just led in with there around the fact that it did take 18 months to see what's referred to as the NEMPs in acronym soaked land that we all occupy on the daily is, I think, down to a couple of things. One, it's worth noting that this wasn't an explicit commitment from the Albanese government, in the lead up to the election that saw them come into government, right? So I think on reflection, it's significant to note that they prioritised this work early on when it wasn't an explicit commitment.
Yep.
But I think also then having, rushed into consultation, we're all very much involved in that and wanting to see the work happen quickly because, as many of us will have noted in that process, there are a lot of things that could happen very quickly, and we were keen to see some ambition laid up on the demand side, given the focus, as you come to expect, I guess, here on the supply side of the equation in and around election commitments. And in subsequent months, after the flurry of consultation, and we started to see, obviously not just the government proceed with a lot of, meaty work on the safeguard mechanism and vehicle emission standards and things like that. There was also a commitment to doing sectoral plans, which wasn't necessarily also contemplated, in the lead up to them getting government. So my take on that would be that the resources that were available to this earlier on in the process may have ended up being stretched a little bit and focused elsewhere on new and emerging processes. And for those of us that have been around this space for a while, And I don't want to say I'm in that cohort that I describe as cynics, but we've, this is familiar territory for some of us. There was a national strategy for energy efficiency from the Rudd-Gillard government in sort of 2010. Then we saw the next iteration of that being the National Energy Productivity Plan, which had a target to increase energy productivity by 40% between 2015 and 2030, released in 2015. But really, I think you could safely say this sort of area of policymaking has suffered a real lack of ambition and focus of governments in the past decade. And so I think many advocates in this space were keen to see something ambitious that's sort of commensurate with the task ahead of us, right? There are, significant demand side targets, if you like, embedded in documents or assumed in certain framework like the ISP's central scenario, for example. But there isn't, a home for anything to articulate an overarching sense of ambition on what we should be doing to drive energy efficiency, fuel switching, demand flexibility. That there isn't an economy-wide target. There isn't, a clearly articulated plan to overhaul the governance of our energy markets or policy processes to have, a much clearer focus on demand-side policy. And so I think even though on the one hand you could say, some of the sectoral plans that are coming out at the end of the year may well be better homes for some of the policies that you would expect to see in this as it relates to relevant, sectors like the built environment, like industry, for example. But that doesn't explain away, I think, the need to really capture some of those cross-cutting actions around ambition, around governance, around, how you kind of bring consumers and the broader community along for the ride with some of the behaviour change aspects that are implicit in demand-side policy. So I think it's fair to say that if you hadn't known or heard that the National Energy Performance Strategy was released, that's probably because the government didn't release it with a lot of fanfare, and probably because there wasn't, a crowd of stakeholders cheering its release on. And, I say that very much as someone who wants to see a strong, committed focus in this space. So I think the hope of an optimist would be that you take the statement, it's a framework to be built on at face value, and you engage in good faith on that. But I also think there is, very understandable reasons for people who were waiting for this to be very disappointed with the lack of ambition and, and some policy actions you would expect to see in here that aren't.
So a long time ago now, back in 2015, when you may remember there was a thing going on in trade land called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I heard a former head of the World Trade Organization asked some questions about it in a conference, and he said, TPP, not very much trade in that. And there's not very much energy performance in this strategy. It's energy performance would be nice, and here's a vision of what would be involved in that. And it doesn't, as you've both said, it doesn't move the ball forward really very much. I think one of the things that may have gone wrong here is that a couple of significant energy efficiency and electrification related initiatives just had to be done and committed to by the government while this was still in various stages of going on to and off and back on the boil. as part of the negotiations with the Greens to get passage of the energy intervention related legislation, and then more in the last budget that was in the space. And I have a feeling that bean countery types, and I may, I speak as a former bean counter myself, may have said when it came towards the business end of this process, you already got a couple of things. What more do you want? Just give them a nice statement of what's good and don't spend very much money. I think this thing announces maybe $16 million of like departmental funding to do and update the strategy.
Yeah.
It's not very much, but they sort of jumped their own gun to some extent. So maybe, if it had its time, we'd be saying, wow, an extra $1 billion or whatever the case would have been.
Whilst I can appreciate that perspective, I think what I would come back to and harp on a little bit is that when you look at we should say it's being presented as a framework, it has a vision. All Australians can enjoy the economic, climate and health benefits of improved energy performance. There are 5 focus areas: economy-wide momentum, households, communities, business and industry, energy system, and technology and innovation. And there are a bunch of objectives under all that, and then there are supporting actions. So look, as a framework, when you look at it down to the level of objectives, I don't think there's too much you can, disagree with there. It's like a fair capture of, a spread of issues that's pretty well known and, has been detailed to some extent or other in previous versions of these kinds of strategies. But if you were to ask the government, well, what are your priorities in relation to energy performance? I just don't think that this strategy actually tells you that. I think that there are, as I said, I think there are policies alluded to but not detailed in here that you would expect to see. So, I think there's, to your point, Tennant, maybe I think there's, a little bit more going on here in terms of timing and when things could and couldn't be included. But I think it's a real missed opportunity to provide a stronger signal around the level of ambition we want to see. We remarked on the government's commitment at COP last year to sign up to the tripling of renewables and doubling the annual rate of energy efficiency improvements out to 2030. There is a level of ambition stated in these global processes that we're a part of. And I would have hoped at the very least to see that reflected here in some way.
And there's multiple drivers of urgency. And the only other one I will add is last episode, we were talking about the gas statement of opportunities, which says there's a honking big gap between expected supply of gas and expected demand for gas. And that, because of the nature of it, and we've had some correspondence on GSU, because of the nature of it, it focused very much on the supply side solutions. It would be a great time for some very specific quantities of demand side ambition to take the load off the need for probably stranded new investments in gas supply.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Ultimately, that's what really, really worries me. And I take both of your points around capacity constraints, and there was some funny timing around some significant commitments when I don't think it was necessarily just the bean country bit of it. It was also the fact that resources got drawn away from the development of this strategy onto delivering the Home Energy Upgrade Fund. That was a very significant sort of commitment and a lot of personnel was devoted to that. But I think we have to be fairly clear-eyed about the fact that it's really concerning that it took 18 months to release a document that effectively provides a broad strategic compass bearing and a list of existing commitments and a few markers for further work. And you mentioning the GSU tenant just underlines why that's an issue, that we spun our wheels for 18 months, because there are really pressing issues for which the demand side is absolutely crucial. The stuff we raised on our GSU episode is a great example of this. Things like the rate of electrification of buildings and industry, and fixing the thermal performance of homes. That has huge implications for supply side transition. So this is not just something out on the periphery that we can just like not worry about. This is actually fundamental to the energy transition, let alone how critical energy performance is to credible emissions reduction targets for 2030 and 2035 and 2040 and beyond. We just don't have time to kind of lock ourselves in a room, stroke our chin, think deep thoughts, and then come out with something which doesn't significantly move the ball forward. So if this had been released sort of 9 or 10 months ago, I think everyone would have just gone, okay, we've had a significant budget. This is a broad framework. Let's roll up our sleeves and kind of get on with it. But the delay is concern, and I think we need to really use the next few months to pick up the momentum to ensure that we do go into the next term of government with the wind at our backs, because there's a huge amount to do on this, and we just can't afford to not be grasping those opportunities. We'll be really, really sorry if we don't.
Yeah, I think the sense of urgency is appropriate. And, for someone who's been advocating a national rating scheme for the performance of homes for a decade, just to see that kind of not given, a rocket under through this process, and really common sense things like the expansion of the commercial building disclosure program and the like those things were ready to go and really needed some leadership and focus. So I think we do need to lean in and make it happen.
Yes. Well, shall we chat about a report?
We should.
It's a report that's going to highlight the value of ambitious and large achievements in energy efficiency, because of very big things that need to get done.
2024 is shaping up as a very big year for the revamped Climate Change Authority, the independent agency that provides expert advice to the Australian Government on climate change policy. As well as its annual report on progress towards our emissions reduction targets, it has two other big jobs this year. It is required to provide advice on Australia's 2035 emissions reduction target, which is a big deal, as the target we land on will form the basis of our updated nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, which needs to be submitted to the UNFCCC by early 2025. And the CCA has also been tasked with looking at emissions reduction opportunities for the government's 6 sectoral decarbonisation plans, which encompass energy, transport, industry, agriculture, resources, and the built environment. All that means the CCA has a lot to chew over, and it has invited input from stakeholders via a new issues paper that covers both sectoral pathways and the 2035 target. This paper is a pretty interesting window into the CCA's current thinking on some really critical issues. Tennant, what did you make of it?
So it is a bit of both a feast of meaty but very rapidly introduced and then moved on from ideas, and in some ways like a cook's tour of the subject matter of this podcast over the last couple of years. There's a lot of papers that we have and issues that we've found interesting, including most obviously and easily explicably past papers of the CCA itself that are referenced in here. And I am not going to start by focusing on any of those broader interesting issues. I'm going to focus in on the thing that everybody wants from this report or this paper, which is what's the number?
What's the target, Tennant?
Yeah, what's the right number for Australia to target for 2035? And what the CCA do here is go through a lot of different possible logics for how you derive a number. So one of them is like what is needed to achieve 1.5 degrees, or what does the science say? And it's a really complicated one, actually, because it's even more complicated than they make clear, because there's a lot of ways that you can frame what you're trying to achieve and derive different numbers. But for what it's worth, CCA broadly say the science says something between 67% and 77% off 2005 by 2035. What do diplomatic commitments imply? What have we signed up to internationally? What does that mean? And Paris says well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. At COP28, we collectively called for 1.5 aligned NDCs, which was said to mean 60% off 2019 levels globally by 2035. And CCA says, well, that's 67% off 2005 without any allowance for equity or capacity. You could look at it in like what's ambitious given what other countries are doing, and we don't yet really know what other countries are doing, but you can straight line other stuff they've said about 2030 through what they say about 2050, and that gets you to maybe 60s to 70s type numbers. What do you think we'll just achieve with current policy if we don't do anything more? And that's like 53% with additional measures, or 56% if we do the rate of change we need for to meet the 2030 target. What do the states' commitments amount to? And that's a bit tricky because some of them haven't said nearly as much as others. But the CCA eyeball it and say 69% by 2035. What's the most we think we could actually do without the wheels falling off our society or economy? And CCA, I don't know, look in the crystal ball and say beyond 75% is not practically doable by 2035.
Their language on that is rather strong. Like if you consider everything you've just said there in terms of how you could slice it and dice it, I feel like their upper limit was very firm in their commentary in suggesting that anything over 75% was likely to cause a lot of economic pain.
Yeah.
And transition issues, equity issues, all of that.
And you can also just, you could try, and I've put this at the end of my list, and the work is ongoing in CCA land. You could try modelling what number would give you the maximum benefits and the minimum of costs and the greatest net result. And they watch this space for what that particular set of magic numbers is. But I don't know that modelling should be all that prominent. Economic modelling should be all that prominent in this because it's problematic. So what they say is, well, they're thinking about a range from 65 to 75%. They don't think we can go higher than that. They're interested in feedback about all of that, but that's where they're thinking right now. And this matters in part because these are really tricky issues, and very, very few people, I think, will feel super confident about deriving themselves the right number under any of those logics, and they will look to others to either react against some number that somebody says that's like irresponsibly low because of who that person is, or crazily high because of who that person is. And some of them will look for the moderate, sensible centre, and CCA is trying to define what that moderate centre is. And it's like it's a big number compared to the 2030 number. It's a big number compared to today. It's not big compared to some ways that you could look at what 1.5 degrees requires. It would take a lot of doing. And
they do point to other studies that suggest that, far more ambitious targets and timeframes are needed here as well. I forget the name of the paper, but one was, eyeballing net zero by 2038 to be consistent with 1.5 degrees. So, I think by no means are they taking the most aggressive viewpoints into their analysis or suggesting that that's feasible for us.
Malte Meinshausen's jointly authored paper was that
That's
one.
the one.
And I don't think that he's necessarily saying there, he and collaborators are necessarily saying there, we've done economic modelling or we've done a bottom-up analysis of sectors or whatever, and this is what can and will be delivered. They're saying, if you want a strong chance of 1.5 degrees and if you ascribe a specific level of obligation to Australia as a relatively rich, a very rich country, a very advanced economy, to have a decent share of the global effort towards that, then 2038 net zero. Can we do net zero in 2038? I don't know. If you slice that science question a different way, an ethics question a different way, we've already spent the carbon budget. And nobody wants to hear that because it's like, well, what do you do?
Well, and the other thing to say about what the science tells us, the range that they're talking about there, 67 to 77%, that's very 50% chance, in the broad, of meeting 1.5.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not a betting woman, but, I don't like those odds particularly. So, I think there's a strong rationale for saying, one, because we are, a developed country and a rich nation, we should be doing more than what the global average effort requires. So that, would tend to put you somewhere towards the upper limit of that range. The other thing I think would be more influential in an Australian context in terms of the different ways you could slice and dice this is if they're saying that you throw all the states' commitments into a blender and that sort of gets you...
That's where they belong.
A 69% smoothie.
What are these crazy Victorians thinking?
Yes, advised by 1T Reid.
What? Who's that guy?
I think less than 69 is not super defensible if you're looking at, at least matching or, one would think building on what the states have done. So I don't know, if I was gonna have a bob on this, I'd be saying it should be 70 or higher based on that.
It's hard to read this and not get the strong sense that the Climate Change Authority is trying to get out of the gate early and define the window of credibility.
Yeah,
it's a little bit of a Goldilocks scenario. These targets lack ambition.
Yes.
These targets are too ambitious, but these targets are just right. Right? And I mean, early in the paper, they sort of say, well, overly conservative targets will perpetuate a sense of inertia and we won't build the momentum we need. But overly ambitious targets without realistic pathways to achieving them can undermine the credibility of policy efforts. And I noticed that kind of hard ceiling on 75% as well. And I don't think they really justify it in the paper. They just assert it. It seems to be like as much a political analysis as a kind of technology or scientific analysis. It seems like what they're grappling with is the question of how fast we can go given practical constraints, which is about deployment of existing tech and development of new technology, and then political constraint, which is like a really interesting question around what level of transformation is possible while holding together a political coalition for climate action. And I've sort of got this, while I was reading this, I had this image of, that steam engine in Back to the Future 3, which is like barreling down the railway tracks, and they just keep throwing in these, I don't know, like this weird chemical combustible things that Doc Brown has
the fuel of the future,
right? And because they need to get it up to 88 miles an hour, but they need to do it without blowing the boiler.
Yes.
Right? It's like how hard can we push our economy and our society to get us where we need to go without blowing the whole thing up is kind of fundamentally the question that we've got, right?
There's a visual I wasn't expecting for this conversation, but it'll make a great meme on the other side.
It implies an engineer's cap and a sooty face for some of the hardworking professionals at the CCA.
Mr. Topham Hat overseeing all operations, says the person who watches too much Thomas the Tank Engine with small children.
So I'm going to compound the festival of references by saying, until Harry Seldon and his science of psychohistory comes along and can calculate with absolutely precise equations the movements and clashes of large groups of people, those political judgments or social and technological judgments, they are destined to remain highly arguable judgments. The modelling is not going to answer how hard can you push things in any way that anybody should put any weight on whatsoever. There are limits. Like, I think everybody will agree that there are limits, and nobody's going to agree on where they are. And like, is 75 the outer limits of feasible ambition? There are people out there with more bottom-up type reports saying, no, we can do more than that. I've recently read one of those reports, and I thought a lot of things in it were a reach. You know, when we're dealing with stocks of vehicles, stocks of buildings, it's hard to move the needle on those things super duper rapidly.
I think the challenge that emerges, if you can call it getting past low-hanging fruit, or policy instruments where you can hit big chunks of emissions by working with relatively fewer, entities or, sort of proponents out there in the economy. What's left is the really hard to shift stuff, either because the technology is nascent in hard to abate sectors, or because, there's a reason it's hard to reduce emissions in those sectors, like either due to really fragmented stakeholders that all need to make a lot of, change, which needs, a lot of serious policy thinking. Refer previous conversation about energy performance. It's not like you're saving the easiest thing for last here, right? It gets harder. The higher that number you get, because you're dealing with the stuff that hasn't already shifted because it's easier to.
It definitely gets harder at the margin. I think there is good attention paid in this paper to the sorts of good news that we've had a look at over the last couple of years on where deployment and learning rates can make some very big and important things much easier as you go by doing them. But there are a lot of residual challenges that we don't have great answers to yet. The ag sector, the biggest hope here is methane reducing feed supplements. And CCA reckon it's a pretty fair assessment that more research is needed, more work is needed on establishing, there's a wide range of different impacts of those supplements in reducing emissions in different current studies. How the hell are we going to distribute them to the vast majority of livestock that are not on feedlots, or even they don't talk about dairy cattle, but dairy cows at least come into one location to be milked a couple of times a day, and you can slip them a bit of seaweed, a bit of sneaky asparaginopsis while they're at it. But rangeland beef, rangeland sheep, the whole point of them is that you don't bring the feed to them. So that stuff is hard. And there's a lot of things that are hard. But still, like they're saying their judgment is they think 65 to 75 could be done with a lot of effort and smart policy, and they're interested in ideas about policy. People can try and react to this and say, no, 80 is the right number or whatever. Or some people will look at this and say, no, we can't get past even the 2030 number will be a struggle and we can't get past 50. But I think this is going to define the middle ground of this debate to a substantial extent.
I think it's really interesting, them actually breaking down what particular targets mean in terms of megatons of emissions reductions in particular periods. It notes that the average decline since 2010 has been around 11 megatons of CO2 equivalent a year on average, and that we need to ramp that up to 16 megatons a year to meet our 2030 target. If we want to pick up the pace again between 2030 and 2035, then that implies we're reducing our emissions in that period between 27 and 39 megatons, depending on whether you're at the lower end or the upper end of that band. But the interesting thing about that for me, say it's 27, say we go for 65, like we're not going to transition from 16 megatons a year to 27 megatons a year from 2030 to 2031, right? Like as soon as you define a more ambitious 2035 target, you by definition need to start doing more stuff that is going to ramp up over the time. And I think it means that you need to significantly overperform our 2030 target to hit your 2035 target, even if you go for what people would regard, based on this, as something at the lower bound of credibility for 2035. So this has more immediate implications. This isn't something that we get to worry about in 2031, but as soon as we define a 2035 target, we need to start preparing and ramping up a whole bunch of additional activity to allow us to hit that run rate.
And particularly activities that don't pay off for a while. Like they need to start right away.
Yeah. I thought one of the best examples of that picked out in the little insights they gave into their thinking on sectoral plans is in the transport space. Where, like we've just been discussing vehicle efficiency standards. And the suggestion is that if we're, a hope of, of meeting the more ambitious targets, basically all new cars need to be electric around the 2035 mark, or 2035 to 2040, right? Like that is not far away. That's not long to go from the car yards we see today, with our Uber SUVs and diesel trucks and that, to pretty much everything being an EV. Like, that's a significant shift in a not very long period of time.
Yeah. And you, for that kind of change, for further changes to appliance standards, to home and other kinds of building standards, they're things that need some substantial work on the content of the standards, but then they need a decent period to be signalled for industry and for people to get ready for them. Yep. So now there are, as we've previously noted, there's a bunch of major reviews set for basically 2026 once this whole process has led to a decision about what the national economy-wide target will be. And then there's reviews in 26 of the safeguard mechanism. How's that going? And what has to happen to the decline rates for the baselines to reflect the 2035 target? The vehicle efficiency standards. What is the rate of decline or tightening of those standards after 2029? And just times that exercise by every other area of climate-related policy, energy efficiency policy, next stages of electricity market reform or underwriting or whatever else. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of rampant that is going to have to follow any of these numbers.
And I think a lot that engages many Australians directly, in a way that, discussion around the safeguard mechanism isn't necessarily resonating with people cooking their dinner, in the kitchen at night.
You're breaking my heart, Frankie.
But the reality of this, transition and the need for it to be happening, everywhere all at once, means that we need to be, transitioning millions and millions of homes off of fossil gas, in the coming decades, and installing induction cooktops and heat pumps, at a rate that we're certainly not seeing now, and that the highest of high ambition, in other countries around the world still probably isn't fast enough. So, that environment looks pretty different from an everyday Australian's perspective in 10 years' time than it does today.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing that they're doing with this paper is continuing to kick along the conversation around carbon removal. They have been they've been prosecuting for a little while. There was that paper that we covered on the pod last year that did a deep dive on this topic. So they're thinking about land sector sequestration, but importantly also direct air capture, so engineered removals. And the interesting, and I think likely to be somewhat controversial, thing that they're not saying that they're going to do, but they're sort of thinking about, and I think they're thinking out loud to see what the reaction is the idea that as well as their whole of economy net zero target, they would have sort of three sub-targets. One would be what they're describing as gross emissions reduction targets, that glide path of emissions reductions that we're seeing across the economy, but also land sector removal target and an engineered removal target, presumably for 2035 and 2050, but they're not quite explicit about that.
Yeah. I think it's a big deal. I think it's
a big intellectual change.
It really is. And I think, we've talked about a couple of papers in and around this, but the conversation around particularly engineered removals and how much of the task falls to removals beyond, the straight vanilla emissions reductions that we spend a lot of time talking about. It's very nascent in Australia. And I think it would be very compelling, even if through their modelling exercise they were able to give an indication of, the size of the task or what kind of tentative ambition you would put against each of those three columns. Because as I think we've remarked when we've talked about particularly engineered removals, which, the technology is so early stage, are there commercial DAC systems working yet? The examples are very, very few and far between. So to be saying in 2024 there needs to be a target on that, and we expect that doing all the things that we spend our time talking about on emissions reduction is still not going to be enough to get us to 1.5 or a hope of it, is a big deal. And I think it will start to drive a lot of activity, in terms of thinking in that space. And do we think it's going to have the intended or otherwise effect of sharpening focus on more ambition on the gross reduction side of things?
So I think that this does need more discussion and the issues to be drawn out a little more fully than they are in this paper, because circling back to the different ways that you can slice the science part of what's the right number, their 75% number, the high end of what they're thinking about, globally that implies a substantial degree of overshoot. That is that we would bust globally the carbon budget consistent with 1.5 degrees, and then we would claw our way back with a period of net negative emissions. And there's bits and pieces throughout this sort of acknowledging that, and that would be quite a big deal to try to achieve, and quite expensive to do the very large negative emissions part of it. But that does need to be more clearly part of the way that everybody else approaches this. The less we are able to do now, the more we're going to have to pay through the nose later to have a snowball's chance in hell, pretty literally, of achieving getting back to 1.5 degrees. And I think they could go further. I've been banging on about this for a long time, but in bringing fiscal budget type thinking to what's the financial cost that we're storing up for ourselves for every tonne that we don't avoid emitting now, that we're going to wind up clawing out of the atmosphere with enormous fans powered by vast amounts of renewable energy that we would rather use for something else if we could.
Yeah, I really welcome this. I think this is something we discussed on the podcast last year. A lot of the national targets around the world, if not the vast majority of them, are really sort of murky on the role of removals in, the ultimate goals that they have, whether they're for 2045 or 2050 or beyond. And one of the things we said was it would be really helpful to start being a lot more explicit about that so that we can have this conversation, the trade-offs between near-term emissions reduction and relying on some of these other methods over the medium and the long term. We need to understand, I guess, the different columns in the equation that we're working towards to have any hope of achieving the numbers that need to add up to net zero by 2050.
I think this is now a space or a stream of work of theirs that we might watch very closely, because the other bit of work they mentioned that they'll be doing is some work to map and almost quantify how much sequestration potential Australia has, whether that's, sort of geological deposits and things like that, but to kind of run the ruler over that and see how much of that is actually feasible to use.
Yeah.
That will be a super fascinating exercise also.
And super arguable, no doubt.
Of course.
The physical potential is easier than to define, although people still argue about it, than but what could we really do in practice? So I agree. Let's come back to that one.
Yes. We haven't spoken about the IAMs and the economic model they're going to do, but lest we open that particular can of worms, maybe we should just move right along. Nordhaus, see you later.
There are two cans. Choose your own can. Do you want to talk about the glancing reference to integrated assessment models or the glancing reference to carbon border adjustment mechanisms?
I'm going to be virtuous in my silence unless absolutely necessary. Suffice to say, there's plenty to be said about both.
Yeah, there is. I think I will just nod in a wink that they're going to do some economic modelling as well, which will look to well-established integrated assessment models that we have spoken about in the past, and no doubt we'll have more things to say in future too.
Is this us being disciplined? Are we stopping talking now?
Trying really, really hard, mate.
Okay. as always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. And I'll break convention and kick us off because I actually have a CCA-related one more thing, and that is that we recently received some listener mail from no less an eminence than Climate Change Authority CEO Brad Archer. Brad listened to our recent episode on the government's National Climate Risk Assessment, that exercise that is currently being undertaken by DQ, and in the course of that chat, I rather cheekily speculated on the potential future role for the CCA in undertaking a regular independent climate risk assessment, rather than leaving that task with the department in perpetuity. And this prompted a very nice email from Brad, who proceeded to explain a few things to me. He noted that there is nothing in the Climate Change Authority Act 2011 that precludes them from talking about adaptation, although historically the things they have been tasked with have been mitigation focused. He also noted that the Climate Change Act 2022 does require the CCA to provide advice on the physical impacts of climate change, and that their most recent progress report recommended that regular climate risk assessments and reviews and updates of the National Adaptation Plan be legislated, although Brad hastens to add that they didn't express a view on who should undertake that work. Though I do think he appreciated your comment, Tennant, that they already had quite a lot on. So he's not necessarily putting his hand up.
CCA do, in the report that we just read, note a couple of times that particular issues are very interesting, but that there's no room for them in their 2024 work plan.
Indeed. All right. Listener mailbag. We also got a longer email from a friend of the pod, Dylan McConnell. Dylan, we don't have time to address all the issues that you raised about our GSU episode. We might circle back to it. I think we're all reflecting on it, but it was a very well thought through, contestation of some of the thoughts that we brought to that podcast. We're reflecting on them and look forward to picking them up. I don't know, either on a future pod or over a beer at some point in the future.
I think that we could probably fill an episode with a Jisoo Koro related chat at some point. While we're on it, I just want to do a very quick shout out to Tim Forsey, friend of the pod, also an eminence. He is a long time energy assessor for homes, but he wrote to me on LinkedIn to say, Frankie, it's your first GSU. And he said he was listening to the pod, and he noted that for his past sins, he'd had a role in putting together the 2011 GSU document. But these days, for those of you that might have recognised the name, he helped create the My Efficient Electric Home Facebook group, which is very well patronised these days. And he's, a commentator and advisor of note on all things efficiency, electrification of homes. So I'm just so stoked that Tim listens to the pod. Thanks, Tim.
All right, we'll close up the listener mailbag for this episode, but you can always send in your thoughts to mailbag@letmesumup.net. But Tennant, what have you got?
So I've got another report. This one is pretty timely and interesting for Australia, given that we're in the process of getting some new vehicle efficiency standard legislation through the Parliament. The European Commission, little outfit who do some good work from time to time, put out their first report on the gap between the real-world emissions of light vehicles in the EU and what their emissions were expected to be under the current test procedure that's used as the basis, among other things, of their vehicle efficiency standards. The Worldwide Harmonised Light Vehicle Test Procedure, or WLTP, which I'm going to call WULTIP. I don't know what anybody else does, but that's me. And what they found is... So WULTIP was introduced because the old procedure was thought to be really inaccurate, and they found by using data, and this is really cool, data collected in the cars themselves by the cars, all new cars in Europe have to be fitted with onboard computers that will monitor how they're driving and what their fuel use and emissions actually are, and then most of them can report that data over the air to the manufacturer, and the Commission can tap the manufacturer on the shoulder and say, "I'll have that data, thank you very much." I don't know, a legion of unfaithful French husbands might be dreading other uses of this data, but for emissions purposes, it's gold. And what it's finding is WULTIP is a little bit more accurate than the old procedure when it comes to petrol and diesel, traditional internal combustion engine cars, although it's still underestimating them a bit. But it's finding that emissions from hybrid cars have been dramatically underestimated, that in real-world conditions they are being driven in electric mode much less often than the WULTIP assumptions would have had it, and as a result the emissions are 3 to 4 times higher.
Oh, that's a huge amount. What?
Yeah. They're still more efficient and cleaner than traditional ICE vehicles, but it's modest. It's not huge. And so Australia, well, you're watching this. Now, Europe, the Commission says, well, we had wind of this and we've already got agreement to changes to the assumptions that go into the test procedure in 2025 and 2027 to fix the hybrid treatment. And with this new data, they may fix them further. Australia is going to be using WULTIP in a few years' time, and so we just better bloody well make sure that we're following the state of the art in changes to that procedure, or there will be some disappointment among drivers who will not be enjoying the collective savings that they would expect to. So thanks, European Commission.
Well, very timely for us.
Indeed. All right. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, this is a terribly sad note to end us on this week, but I couldn't think of anything else I wanted to talk about today except to pay tribute and raise a glass to friend of the pod, but also friend to so many in the built environment sector, Jeff Robinson, who really tragically passed away last weekend in Melbourne, and I just wanted to reflect on his legacy. If you worked in and around the property sector and sustainable buildings, you knew Jeff. He was a larger-than-life character, both literally, 6 foot tall, towering giant of an Irishman, but also, I think one of the biggest hearts and most courageous advocates I ever met for climate action in the building space. He would very often be the first person to ask a question at any industry event you found yourself at. Jeff was ubiquitous. He was everywhere, all at once. He made really huge personal and professional contributions to a lot of industry associations, including the one I work for. And I think it sort of just emerged since he passed away, just how broad and deep his influence has been. There's been a collective outpouring of grief that I have never seen before, and I just wanted to mark my own personal tribute to him here, because I saw him not long ago, 2 weeks ago, when we were at the ASBEC meeting together, Luke, and he was chewing my ear off about building standards, as he always was, urging us to get on with bloody requiring ventilation, of homes so that we could build tight, ventilate right, as he used to say a lot. And I just think it's horribly sad, and I wanted to extend, our sympathies to his family, friends, and the many thousands of people in our industry that his life touched, including mine. And I was trawling back through my phone to find, my last picture with him or something, and I found a message he wrote me a couple of years ago when I took my little son to an industry conference while still on parental leave. And he wrote me this lovely, thoughtful message afterwards, like, great to see you, and you're cute as a button, kid. And by the time he's 8, let's hope that he'll be living to see a built environment that's fully electrified and and efficient, and by the time he's 18, completely decarbonised, like he was always thinking about the legacy of what we're leaving for the people that come after us, and mentored many people. So I know I'm rambling a little bit, but it's been a very sad week for those of us working in the built environment. And Vale, Jeff, we're going to miss you a lot.
Yeah, he was a really remarkable bloke, and he invested, as you say, so much time back into the industry, whether it was the not-for-profits he worked with or the people he mentored, or just so generous with his praise when he saw someone making a difference. He really always went out of his way to make it known that their efforts were appreciated. So it is a great loss.
There's lots of tributes flowing online for Jeff, but I will, for those who, and it would have been hard to not notice this if you were in his orbit, but there is a memorial forest being planted in his honour. So I will post a link to that in the show notes, as well as a message board where you can write your own personal tribute to Jeff in case you weren't aware of it already.
All right. Well, on that somber note, it is our show for today. As I said, you can send in your comments, your questions, your reports to mailbag@letmeSumUp.net. But Tennant, we also have a back catalogue of episodes. Where is that?
That can be found at letmeSumUp.net. Every episode that we've done so far, unless you're looking for bonus content, in which case you should go to patreon.com/letmeSumUp.
Yep.
And then you'll have to join. And then you get the bonus content.
Yeah, thanks for stepping us through the Patreon business model.
I'm here to tell people how to suck eggs any day of the year.
All right. Well, for Frankie Muskovich and Tanner Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.